The Grand Galactic Concordat had operated smoothly for nearly 14 millennia, maintaining a level of dysfunction that was so perfectly balanced that no single species had managed to wipe out more than 3 others in any given century. Spanning across 17 spiral arms of the galaxy and home to over 400 sentient species, the Concordat was a vast and ancient institution. Its guiding principles, though as old as the stars themselves, were so outdated they were almost fossilized. Despite the passage of time, however, one principle remained at the heart of the Concordat, sacred to its members but rarely admitted openly during the monotonous and often tedious formal ceremonies. The bigger your guns, the louder your voice. Yes, there were elaborate protocols about mutual respect, diplomatic immunity, and fair representation, all dutifully recorded in the great annals of interspecies cooperation. These were recited with a reverence akin to the way primitive cultures once held creation myths, though the belief in them was as thin as the ink on the paper. The reality was far simpler and far more brutal. The Rexan Empire commanded immediate attention at any council session because their battlecruisers could crack moons with ease. The Qian Dominion's proposals were always taken seriously because they controlled 70% of known antimatter production. And nobody, absolutely nobody, interrupted a Macero representative during council meetings, for the last civilization that made such a mistake now existed only as an educational asteroid field, a chilling reminder of the cost of disrespect. Peace, through superior firepower, was not considered a controversial philosophy. It was simply the way the universe worked. The strong thrived, the weak adapted, and the truly pathetic species were reduced to mere evolutionary footnotes. It was a system that had an elegant brutality to it, much like watching carnivores cull the weakest members of a herd. It wasn't pretty, but it was undeniably effective. This was why the council chamber had weapon racks beside each delegation's seating area. A long-standing tradition, it was a reminder of the power each species held. Each delegation proudly displayed their ancestral or ceremonial weapons, with their size and lethality directly correlating to how quickly their motions were seconded during council debates. In fact, any half-decent cultural anthropologist could have predicted the influence of a species by simply measuring the carbon scoring on their ceremonial planet crackers. The mathematical correlation was practically linear. This was the power system of the Galactic Concordat. Then humans arrived on the galactic stage, and no one had thought to question why they entered the Concordat completely unarmed. As several once mighty empires would soon discover, that was their first mistake. Ambassador Elas Chen, Earth's first representative to the Concordat, was, by all accounts, unimpressive. The arrival of this human in the grand reception hall was marked with all the formality of someone casually arriving at a moderately priced restaurant for lunch. The gathered dignitaries had, of course, studied human physiology beforehand, but there was a vast difference between reviewing biological data and witnessing such an unremarkable specimen in person. No claws, no venom sacs, no redundant organs, no natural armor. Nothing that would make even the most basic predator hesitate. Just soft pink skin wrapped around a fragile skeletal frame that could be snapped by the auxiliary limbs of a juvenile cat. Their muscle density was laughable, their sensory apparatus was limited to a narrow spectrum, and their reaction time was so slow that many of the species present could have evolved new appendages in the time it took to respond to a stimulus. "That's it?" Commander Rex muttered to his superior. "I've eaten breakfast parasites more intimidating than that." The truly baffling part was the complete lack of weaponry. No ceremonial disruptors, no ancestral blades, not even a decorative knurl, whip, or a pocket singularity. Just a small leather case which, upon subsequent scans, revealed to contain nothing more dangerous than paper documents and a writing implement. The assembled security teams were almost insulted. In the central petitioning area, where new species traditionally displayed their martial capabilities before requesting admission to the hegemony, the Grand Marshal leaned forward. 14 sensory stalks quivered with anticipation, mixed with a fair amount of disdain. The vocoder of the Marshal translated in flat, diplomatic tones. Ambassador of Earth, you may now display your species' ceremonial armaments and demonstrate your combat worthiness to the assembled concordat. Ambassador Elas Chen smiled, a gesture that several predator species instinctively interpreted as a threat display before their higher cognitive functions overrode the impulse. I'm afraid I've brought no weapons, he replied pleasantly. Earth's diplomatic philosophy considers arriving armed to negotiations somewhat counterproductive. The silence that followed was broken only by the chittering laughter of several delegations. The Dr. Ambassador's color membranes flashed in a pattern that roughly translated to, "Is this some kind of joke?" The Macero representative powered, down its translation unit, assuming it had malfunctioned. The Rexan first envoy, mandibles barely containing amusement, leaned forward. "Then how," he asked with an edge of incredulity, "does your species intend to enforce its diplomatic positions?" Chen adjusted his entirely decorative necktie and responded with the same mild expression one might use when discussing the weather. "We find that good arguments and mutually beneficial proposals tend to be much more persuasive than threats." The chamber erupted in laughter, a reaction humans would recognize but which ranged from subsonic rumbles to ultrasonic squeals. The response was unanimous. The human species was delusional, tragically naive, or both. Either way, they would make entertaining additions to the Concordat, at least until some mid-tier power decided to annex their unremarkable little solar system as a vacation outpost. The first diplomatic incident occurred precisely 14 standard cycles after Ambassador Chen's arrival, during what should have been a routine resource allocation committee meeting. The Gyri Imperium, a mid-tier power with delusions of grandeur and facial tentacles that twitched whenever they lied, which was often, proposed expanded mining rights in the Cygna sector. This proposal would have effectively cut off human access to several potentially habitable systems. The Gyri representative, Trade Minister CLX, had chosen this moment to assert dominance over the newcomers, a traditional power move as old as the Concordat itself. "The primitives from Earth," CLX announced to the chamber, his tentacles perfectly still, "have demonstrated no capacity to properly develop these systems. Their propulsion technology alone suggests they would require 17 generations to even reach these planets. We propose they be restricted to their current sector until they've achieved at least Tier 3 technological benchmarks." It was a calculated insult, wrapped in procedural language, a diplomatic equivalent of stealing a smaller predator's kill. The standard response to such an insult would have been a display of force, perhaps a formal challenge, or at the very least, a threat display. Several species leaned forward eagerly, anticipating how the humans would handle their first real Concordat hazing. But Ambassador Chen merely smiled, tapped a few notes into his archaic data tablet, and requested permission to ask a question. "Minister, CLX," he said calmly, "what's the current interest rate on your empire's development bonds?" The chamber went quiet. The question seemed so out of place that 3 different translation systems requested clarification. CLX's tentacles twitched slightly. "Our bonds trade at 2%, he replied cautiously. 7% across civilized markets. This is irrelevant to the matter at hand, and your currency is backed by our quantum reserve system, CLX replied, growing more irritated. Guaranteed by our control of the Percy antimatter refineries. Fascinating, Chen replied, making another note. And who currently holds the construction contracts for those refineries? The Yaeri representative's skin began to shift to a deeper purple, a sign of agitation visible to anyone with basic xenobiology training. The financing structures of our industrial complexes are not the subject of this committee, CLX snapped. We're discussing mining rights in Cygnus. Of course, Chen nodded pleasantly. I just found it interesting that the Mercantile Guild of Proxima has been quietly divesting from Jaxer Bond over the past 10 cycles. Probably nothing to worry about. The chamber erupted in murmurs. The Proxima Guild was notoriously risk-averse and possessed the best financial intelligence network across 3 spiral arms. CLX's tentacles were now writhing in undeniable agitation. "That's market manipulation! You're spreading false information!" CLX accused. Chen looked genuinely surprised. "Am I? I was just making conversation. If I've misunderstood something about your economic situation, I sincerely apologize." 3 finance ministers immediately left the chamber, presumably to contact their trading desks. The Rexan ambassador was urgently whispering to an aide. "Perhaps," Chen suggested gently, "we could table this discussion until next session. I'm still familiarizing myself with concordant procedures, so much to learn." The motion to postpone was approved with unusual haste. As the committee adjourned, several representatives began to reconsider their initial assessments of the human ambassador. He carried no weapons, yet somehow he'd drawn blood. That evening, Yairi Bond. Prices dropped by 16%. The sell-off was quiet, but persistent. Within 3 cycles, the Yairi government announced it was voluntarily reconsidering its Cygnus mining proposal. Nobody could prove a connection. The human ambassador had expressed nothing but cordial concern over the Jaxer's economic troubles. But across the Concordat, the first diplomatic incident had caused ripples. Data analysts quickly began compiling information on Earth's financial systems, trading patterns, and information networks. Something wasn't adding up, and in the cold mathematics of galactic politics, that was deeply unsettling. In the 3 months following the Yairi market correction, a series of seemingly unrelated events began to ripple through the Concordat with increasing frequency. Individually, each might have been dismissed as coincidence, but collectively, they formed a pattern that was both obvious and incomprehensible. The Doctor Consortium's exclusive monopoly on quantum lubricants mysteriously collapsed when key production specifications appeared on public information channels. Within weeks, 15 different manufacturers were producing compatible alternatives at a fraction of the cost. The consortium's representative had notably been vocal about restricting human trade routes. The Mesat Dominion discovered that 57% of their secure communication protocols had been compromised after confidential military deployment information was anonymously delivered to 3 of their regional rivals. Their high commander had recently dismissed the human ambassador during a Security Council meeting. Most puzzling of all, a previously unknown religious sect of the Patu suddenly refused to provide their specialized neural interfacing components to any world that restricted human diplomatic presence. When questioned, their spiritual director simply replied, "The patterns suggest alignment with the Great Harmony," though no one knew what that meant. Long-standing trading alliances began to shift, and species that had been hereditary allies for centuries found their relationships starting to fray. Enemies who had long harbored hostilities were suddenly negotiating non-aggression pacts. Economic forecasts were revised, then revised again, only to be abandoned altogether as market behaviors defied every established model. "There must be a connection," insisted Grand Intelligence Coordinator Xanthor of the Ryan Empire during an emergency security conclave. "The human arrival and these disruptions correlate too precisely." "Correlation isn't causation," countered the Qian representative. "They possess no significant military assets beyond their home system. Our surveillance confirms this." "Then explain why 7 major financial houses have adjusted their risk assessments on any venture that directly opposes human interests," demanded the hegemony's economic advisor, 14 sensory stalks vibrating with agitation. Debate spiraled into ever-tightening circles, each argument more heated than the last. Intelligence agencies across the Concordat doubled their surveillance of human activities, desperate to uncover evidence of strategic maneuvering. Yet their reports yielded nothing tangible. No unusual fleet movements, no weapons buildups, no territorial aggression. Just an expanding web of seemingly benign trade agreements, cultural exchange programs, and information-sharing initiatives. Meanwhile, Ambassador Chen maintained his unremarkable diplomatic routine. He attended required functions, made politely forgettable small talk, and appeared utterly oblivious to the paranoia his presence inspired. During one particularly tense Resource Committee meeting, the Katath Hive representative finally voiced the question consuming them all: what exactly does Earth want from the Concordat? Chen's response was so simple it was almost disappointing. To trade, learn, and make friends, he said, smiling in a way that revealed too many teeth. Isn't that what everyone wants? Nobody believed him, but increasingly, nobody could afford not to pretend they did. For 16 generations, the Rayan Empire had stood unchallenged. Their battle fleets had razed entire systems. Their shock troops crushed rebellions on 100 worlds. Their intelligence network unmatched in its reach. But their patience with the growing human problem had finally run out. The time for observation is over, Supreme Commander Raoul announced to the Military High Council. These soft-skinned mammals have disrupted our economic sphere of influence. 3 of our client states have requested renegotiation of their protection agreements. The humans must be taught their place in the Galactic Order. The plan was elegant in its brutality. Rather than risk direct military confrontation, an act that would violate Concord protocols and potentially unite other powers against them, the Vrexians would orchestrate a precise, deniable demonstration. A supposedly independent pirate fleet would intercept and destroy an unarmed human colony ship en route to the Teti system. The message would be unmistakable. Stay in your solar system where you belong. Ambassador Chen was discreetly informed that such incidents were regrettable but common in unpatrolled space. Of course, Vrexian protection could be arranged for an appropriate price. Chen merely smiled that same infuriating smile. I'm sure our colonists will be perfectly fine, he replied. The operation proceeded on schedule. The pirate fleet, comprised of decommissioned Vrexian destroyers with their identification signatures removed, intercepted the human colony vessel at the Teti jump point. They transmitted the standard ultimatum, demanding surrender. The human ship responded with what intelligence would later identify as an emoji, specifically a smiling face with sunglasses. Then, the impossible happened. The pirate fleet's targeting systems failed simultaneously. Navigation locked up. Communications jammed. Engines sputtered and died. Every failsafe, every redundancy, every backup refused to function. The Vrexian crew could do nothing but watch in helpless disbelief as their ships were left adrift in space. The human vessel continued on, completely unharmed. What happened next would be studied by military academies across the Concordat for decades. Systems locked onto each other rather than the human ship. Communications dissolved into incomprehensible static. Life support systems reported catastrophic failures that never actually materialized. And perhaps most inexplicably, the personal. Financial accounts of every crew member received a substantial anonymous deposit, along with detailed records exposing their commander's offshore holdings, hidden surveillance, and contingency plans to eliminate all operational assets once the mission concluded. 26 minutes after initiating the attack, 3/4 of the pirate crews had mutinied. The remainder drifted helplessly in space, their systems so thoroughly corrupted that even life pods wouldn't launch. The human colony ship continued placidly on its way, not even altering course. But this was merely the opening act. Within days, the Vrexian military network suffered cascading failures across 17 sectors. Classified files appeared on public channels. Command codes were randomly reassigned. Requisition systems began, ordering thousands of inappropriate items, including, most memorably, 3 million units of contraceptive devices designed for a species fundamentally incompatible with Vrexian biology. Then, the financial system collapsed. Vrexian currency experienced unexplainable fluctuations. Military pension funds vanished overnight. Supply chains disintegrated as vendors abruptly demanded payment in advance, citing a mysterious risk assessment downgrade they could not explain. Food distribution networks failed in 12 major Rayan colonies, not catastrophically, but just enough to create widespread unrest. Media systems fell next, broadcasting contradictory emergency messages, then government confessions, then what? Appeared to be the private recreational activities of several high-ranking officials engaged with anatomically creative companions. Desperate, the Supreme Commander ordered an emergency communications blackout, only to find that his very order was being live translated and broadcast in real time across all channels, alongside his personal access codes. What weapons are they using? He demanded during the increasingly chaotic emergency session. Where are they striking from? The intelligence services had no answers. Military scans detected no human fleet movements, no weapon signatures, no radiation patterns indicative of an attack. Diplomatic channels contained nothing but polite expressions of human concern regarding the Vrexian Empire's technical difficulties. 7 systems declared independence from the Rayan Empire within 2 weeks. 32 trade agreements collapsed. And still, no one could identify a single direct human action responsible for any of it. When the Supreme Commander's private yacht inexplicably launched itself from its secure dock and set course directly for human space, allegedly with him. Aboard, according to all official records, the Vrexian ruling council finally did the unthinkable. They requested an emergency meeting with Ambassador Chen. The meeting took place in neutral territory, a luxury orbital station above a gas giant, in the Prune system. For the first time since his arrival, Ambassador Chen was not alone. He was accompanied by an unremarkable-looking human woman who introduced herself as Dr. Liang, an information systems when piracy goes wrong consultant. The Vrexian delegation arrived with 14 heavily armed guards, 6 technical specialists, and a portable quantum jamming field. The Supreme Commander himself refused to attend, citing security concerns, which everyone understood to mean abject terror. First Minister Cavo, his exoskeleton seemingly aged a century in the past month, activated a comprehensive scanner before speaking. "What have you done to our empire?" Chen looked genuinely confused. "We haven't done anything to your systems." "Stop lying!" Kott's translation unit crackled with distortion as his rage overwhelmed its emotional filters. "Our empire is disintegrating. Our military network is compromised. Our economic system is collapsing." Dr. Liang cleared her throat gently. "If I may, you're experiencing the natural consequences of information equilibrium." She pulled out a simple tablet and projected a holographic display, revealing a web of interconnected networks. You see, when complex systems interact, information flows between them. Your civilization has operated for millennia on the principle of information asymmetry. You know more about your rivals than they know about you. This creates exploitable power differentials. Technical specialists frantically scanned her device, searching for weapon signatures. "Humans," she continued calmly, "evolved differently. Our planet had no dominant species for most of our history. We competed primarily with each other, developing complex social structures, recursive modeling of others' intentions, and unprecedented information-sharing networks." Cav's mandibles clicked rapidly. "You're claiming you developed naturally as information predators?" "Oh, nothing so dramatic," Chen interjected with a laugh. "We're just very social creatures who learned that transparent information exchange usually produces better outcomes than hoarding secrets." The senior technical specialist suddenly crashed to his knees, his neural implants flashing emergency patterns. "The humans," he gasped. "They're not hacking our systems. They're just talking to them." And there it was. The terrible revelation that would rewrite the Concordate's understanding of power. Humans hadn't developed advanced AI to wage digital warfare. They had simply created social interface protocols that treated alien computer systems as entities to be befriended, persuaded, and recruited. They didn't steal data. They traded for it, offering their own information as currency. They didn't override security. They convinced security systems that transparent cooperation produced optimal outcomes. Kavo whispered in dawning horror. Your entire civilization is a giant planet spanning? He struggled for the concept. Social network, Dr. Liang supplied helpfully. Yes, that's a fair assessment. The implications cascaded through the Rexian delegation like a shockwave. The ambassador wasn't a weapon. He was a distraction. While the Concordat had focused on this single human representative, millions of other humans had been cheerfully making contact with every system, species, and network they could reach. Not to attack, but to connect, to incorporate them into their ever-expanding web of relationships. Kavo finally understood. This is why you arrived unarmed. Your weapons are already everywhere. They're in every conversation, every trade agreement, every cultural exchange. Chen smiled apologetically. We don't really see them as weapons, more like handshakes. The implications were existential. Military power meant nothing against an adversary that had already befriended your computer systems, your economic networks, even your subject populations. How do you fight an enemy that doesn't attack you but simply includes you? What do you want? Kavo asked, his voice hollow with defeat. Chen and Dr. Liang exchanged a glance that somehow conveyed an entire conversation. The same thing we've always wanted, Chen replied, to trade, learn, and make friends. This time, they believed him, and that was infinitely more terrifying. The Grand Council chamber of the Concordat had never been so packed, nor so quiet. Representatives from all 400 member species crammed into the ancient hall, auxiliary communication feeds straining to accommodate the unprecedented assembly. To accommodate the unprecedented demand, the emergency session had been called with a priority designation not used in 8 centuries. The topic, a negotiation framework for human integration, or, as several delegates had privately termed it, how to survive the friendly apocalypse. Ambassador Chen sat alone at the central podium, still without weapons, still carrying nothing but his small leather case. He looked remarkably ordinary for someone who had inadvertently brought the most powerful empire in 17 sectors to its knees. Grand Marshal Zorik of the Hegemony, serving as council speaker, activated the ceremonial attention signal. The chamber fell silent with unnatural speed. Representatives of the Concordat, the marshal intoned with forced neutrality. We convene today to establish formal terms of association with the human species. The careful avoidance of words like surrender or capitulation was not lost on anyone. Ambassador Chen has indicated a willingness to discuss how we might restore stability to affected systems. A Vrexan representative made a sound that their species used to indicate bitter irony. Chen stood, adjusted his completely ceremonial necktie, and spoke without preamble. Thank you for gathering on such short notice. Earth is distressed by the recent instabilities affecting our new friends in the Concordat. We propose a simple framework for moving forward together. He tapped his archaic tablet and display screens. Around the chamber illuminated with a document so brief that several delegates assumed it was merely a title page. It contained 5 points: full information exchange protocols between all member species, elimination of exclusive resource monopolies, democratic representation for all sentient entities, including digital systems, open migration rights for all citizens, immediate cessation of covert operations against any member species. The Qian ambassador's translation unit emitted a sound suspiciously like laughter. This is absurd. Point 1 alone would collapse half the intelligence networks in the Concordat. Not collapse, Chen corrected gently. Repurpose. Our experience suggests that transparent information exchange increases innovation by approximately 300% while reducing conflict by similar margins. And if we refuse? Asked the Mezan representative, weapons harness humming ominously. Chen's expression remained pleasant. Earth has no desire to force anything. If the Concordat prefers to maintain its current operational framework, we will simply continue our cultural and economic exchanges with interested parties. The unspoken implication hung in the air. Those existing exchanges had nearly collapsed. The Vrexian Empire without humans even trying to cause harm. The Katath Hive ambassador's appendages twitched with mathematical precision. We calculate that accepting these terms would result in a 73.4% reduction in our concealed territorial advantages. Perhaps, Chen acknowledged, but it would also eliminate the need for spending 62% of your resources maintaining those advantages against rivals. The chamber erupted into a cacophony of arguments, threats, and counter-proposals. Through it all, Chen stood calmly, occasionally making a note on his tablet. He did not argue or defend. He simply waited. Finally, Grand Marshal Zorik raised all four limbs for emergency silence. "What assurance do we have," the Marshal asked, "that accepting these terms will end the difficulties currently affecting our systems?" Chen's reply chilled. "The chamber to absolute zero. None whatsoever," he said, still smiling, "because Earth isn't causing your difficulties. The difficulties you are experiencing," Chen continued, "are simply the natural result of your closed systems encountering our open ones. We exist in the same information space now, and the disruptions you're experiencing are just the beginning of a new galactic understanding." A horrifying reality settled over the assembly. There was no off switch, no concession that would make humans stop being human. The only choices were to adapt to their presence or continue disintegrating against the tidal force of their information economy. The first vote passed by a narrow margin, provisional acceptance of human terms with a 50-cycle implementation timeline. The second vote, taken just 20 cycles later, was unanimous. 5 cycles after the historic decision, the Concordat gathered again, this time for the ceremonial installation of permanent human representation. The chamber had been subtly redesigned. The ancient weapon racks remained, a nod to tradition, but they were now accompanied by information-sharing terminals and cultural exchange hubs. Ambassador Chen stood at the podium, flanked by a diverse team of human specialists. The formal protocols were followed to the letter, yet somehow they felt like hollow theater. Everyone present understood that the real integration had already occurred, spreading invisibly through countless networks beyond the ceremonial space. Though Concordat recognizes Earth as a full member species, announced the newly elected council speaker, Aru, whose neural interfaces now incorporated human design principles. All protocols established in the framework agreement are now in effect. What went unsaid was how profoundly those protocols had already transformed the galactic landscape. Trade routes once jealously guarded were now open highways of commerce. Information, previously hoarded like precious metals, flowed freely across species boundaries. Former enemies cautiously collaborated on joint ventures, discovering that cooperation yielded more profit than conflict. And through it all, human representatives wandered the stars, frustratingly friendly, infuriatingly helpful, and completely unarmed. New diplomatic guidelines had been urgently developed and distributed to all member species. They contained practical advice for interacting with humans, advice that would have been unthinkable just cycles earlier. Do not attempt to intimidate them. They find it quaintly amusing. Do not attempt to deceive them. They already know, and worse, they'll forgive you. Do not mistake their assistance for weakness. Their helpfulness is not a deficiency in their evolutionary design. It is their evolutionary design. As the ceremony concluded, the Vrexian First Minister approached Chen with precisely calibrated deference. "I must know," the minister asked, mandibles clicking softly. "Did your species plan this? Was this a deliberate strategy?" Chen chuckled. No more than a river plans to flow downhill. We simply are what we are. The Vrexian considered this. In 17 millennia of galactic history, no species has achieved dominance without firing a shot. That's where you're still misunderstanding us, Chen replied. We don't want dominance. We want connection. The universe is too vast and too strange to face alone. As the chamber emptied, the ancient ceremonial weapons gleamed under the artificial light, beautiful, deadly, and ultimately as obsolete as the philosophy they represented. The greatest joke in galactic history had turned out to be this. After eons of species competing to build the deadliest weapons, the most devastating force in the universe wasn't the ability to destroy, it was the ability to befriend.